Imagine standing on a moonlit shoreline where the waves crash like war drums against jagged rocks, and the cold sea breeze carries a warning older than any empire, a whisper that death is coming from beyond the horizon, riding on sails soaked in conquest. The year is 1274, and Japan is on the brink of an invasion unlike anything it has ever imagined, an invasion led by the most feared war machine in human history, the Mongol Empire. They have crushed kingdoms, toppled empires, and turned continents into footnotes. And now, in an astonishing act of defiance, only 200 samurai stand between them and the total annihilation of the island nation. 200 against 50,000 battle-hardened warriors who have marched across Asia like a living storm. Yet what unfolded on the shores of Hakata Bay is not just a tale of impossible odds. It is a story of ferocious courage, unexpected tactics, and a twist of fate that transformed a hopeless last stand into one of the most incredible military upsets the medieval world had ever seen. Because this wasn't just a battle, it was a collision between two entirely different worlds: the disciplined, honor-bound warriors of Japan and the relentless, thunderous juggernaut of Mongol warfare. And tonight, we dive headfirst into the electrifying moment when a handful of samurai refused to bow, refused to break, and unleashed a ferocity so shocking that it stalled an empire. To understand how 200 samurai warriors dared to confront a Mongol force large enough to blot out the horizon, you have to first understand who these Japanese fighters truly were. They were raised in a culture where war was not simply a profession, but a sacred destiny. From childhood, the samurai were trained to move like shadows, shoot arrows with terrifying accuracy, and wield blades so sharp that poets claimed they could slice falling snowflakes in half. Their armor, lacquered and layered, wasn't just protection, it was a second skin. And their swords, the legendary katanas, were more than weapons. They were extensions of their soul, forged with rituals so spiritual, the blade was believed to carry the spirit of its maker. Yet the Mongols brought something Japan had never truly faced: organized, disciplined, battle-tested armies trained under the brutal genius of Genghis Khan's legacy. These invaders were cavalry masters, whose arrows could rain from the sky in deadly swarms. They used tactics that shattered even Europe's strongest knights. They were the apex predators of the battlefield. When Kublai Khan, the ruler of the Yuan dynasty and grandson of Genghis Khan, sent his massive fleet toward Japan, he believed the outcome was inevitable. And why wouldn't he? The Mongols had fought countless armies larger and stronger than this isolated island nation, and they had crushed every one of them. So when the fleet finally anchored off the coast of Kyushu, the villagers looking out from their beaches weren't just afraid, they felt the earth tilt beneath their feet. The sea was blackened with ships, over 900 vessels carrying tens of thousands of soldiers, Mongols, Chinese conscripts, Korean shipwrights, and siege engineers ready to breach Japan's defenses. But here is where the story takes its first shocking turn. Instead of panic or surrender, 200 samurai rode to meet them. 200, not 2,000, not 10,000. 200 men against 50,000 enemies armed with poison-tipped arrows, explosive projectiles, and foreign tactics the Japanese had never encountered. And yet, those 200 samurai didn't hesitate. They didn't negotiate. They didn't wait for reinforcements. They charged. The Mongols expected a slow, cautious response from the Japanese, maybe even attempts to negotiate or stall. But what they got instead was raw, unfiltered samurai fury. The defenders rode onto the beach in full armor, banners flapping wildly behind them, their war cries slicing through the sea air like thunderbolts. Their mission was not to win. Their mission was not even to survive. Their mission was to send a message that Japan would not bow to anyone, not even the most terrifying empire the world had ever known. As the samurai reached the shoreline, the Mongols formed tight shield walls, a tactic the Japanese had never seen. The invaders fought as a unified machine, tight formations, synchronized ranks, coordinated assaults, nothing like the one-on-one honor duels the samurai were accustomed to. And when the two forces clashed, the Mongols unleashed a horrifying surprise: explosive bombs that detonated with blinding flashes and deafening booms. These were the world's earliest grenades, filled with gunpowder and iron shrapnel. When they exploded, they shattered the samurai charge, knocked men flat on the sand, and sent horses screaming and buckling to the ground. Suddenly, shockingly, the samurai found themselves fighting not just an army, but a new kind of warfare. Still, even with explosions ripping through their ranks, those 200 warriors refused to retreat. They repositioned, tightened their line, and launched a series of lightning-fast counterattacks. They moved with the precision of hawks, slashing through Mongol infantry, cutting down archers, and forcing the attackers to commit more and more troops to hold the beach. The Mongols, irritated by the fierce resistance, began to underestimate the samurai. They believed these few warriors were foolish, reckless, nothing more than a symbolic gesture of Japanese pride. But pride, combined with unmatched skill, can become a weapon far deadlier than steel. The samurai archers specifically began to turn the tide in small pockets of the battle. Unlike Mongol composite bows, which were designed for massed volley fire, samurai arrows were engineered for powerful, individual shots that pierced armor with terrifying efficiency. From behind scattered defensive walls and hastily erected barricades, Japanese archers began picking off Mongol commanders. And every time a Mongol officer fell, the invaders' coordination faltered just slightly. Tiny cracks in the massive war machine, cracks created by only 200 defenders who refused to die quietly. But here's the most astonishing part. As night fell, the Mongols withdrew. Not because they feared defeat, but because their battlefield style relied heavily on open-field maneuvering, unified formations, and overwhelming numbers, none of which worked well in the tight, chaotic terrain of a narrow beachhead. The samurai didn't just fight, they disrupted the Mongol battle plan. And in war, disruption can be more powerful than outright destruction. That night, something extraordinary happened. Instead of retreating inland or hiding behind fortified walls, the samurai launched a daring nighttime assault using small, fast boats. They rowed directly toward the Mongol ships anchored offshore. This was one of the most insane acts of defiance in medieval warfare. 200 warriors attacking an armada of 900 ships holding 50,000 soldiers. But the samurai weren't aiming to sink the fleet. Their goal was chaos. They boarded enemy ships silently, killing guards, setting fires, and disappearing into the darkness before the Mongols even realized what was happening. They focused on command ships, cutting down officers, assassinating leaders, and creating confusion so severe that Mongol captains spent half the night shouting conflicting orders. It was psychological warfare, a concept the Mongols usually excelled at. But on this night, the samurai beat them at their own game. As dawn broke, the Mongols realized they had severely underestimated their enemy. Their casualties were mounting, their officers were dead, their formations were weakened, and worst of all, their morale was shaken. But fate was about to deliver the final blow, not from the blade of a samurai, but from the heavens themselves. Late that afternoon, winds began to howl across Hakata Bay. Clouds churned in violent, swirling patterns. The sea transformed into a writhing monster of waves and currents. A typhoon, one of the most powerful to strike Japan in decades, roared across the coastline. The Mongol fleet, anchored in tight formation, was trapped. Their ships slammed into each other, splintering under the force of hurricane winds. Massive waves capsized entire rows of vessels. Soldiers were dragged screaming into the sea. Japan's samurai watched from the cliffs as the storm obliterated the Mongol invasion force in a matter of hours. Out of the 50,000 invaders who had arrived with confidence and overwhelming numbers, only a few thousand survived. And as those survivors washed ashore, wounded, disoriented, defenseless, the samurai finished what nature had started. By the next morning, the beaches that had once echoed with Mongol war songs were silent. The invasion was not just defeated, it was annihilated. And the 200 samurai who initiated the defense became legends. This storm would be remembered by the Japanese as kamikaze, the divine wind, a heavenly shield that protected Japan from being consumed by the Mongol Empire. But here's the truth, often forgotten in the shadow of the typhoon. The storm only mattered because of those initial 200 samurai. If those warriors had broken, if those warriors had retreated, if those warriors had given the Mongols an easy foothold on the beach, Kublai Khan's forces would have marched inland long before the storm hit. Japan would have been conquered. The samurai didn't defeat 50,000 Mongols through brute strength. They defeated them through relentless, unbreakable resistance that slowed the invasion to a crawl and forced the enemy fleet to remain vulnerable in the bay. The storm was the executioner, but the samurai were the ones who tied the Mongols to the execution block. And perhaps the most astonishing part of this story is the legacy it left behind. When the Mongols attempted a second invasion 7 years later, with over 140,000 men, nearly 3 times the size of the first, they were met not by 200 defenders, but by tens of thousands of samurai now armed with improved defenses, upgraded fortifications, and new tactics forged in the fire of that first battle. And yet again, another massive typhoon struck. The Mongol fleet was shattered a second time. Not a single Mongol soldier ever successfully marched into the Japanese mainland. And it all began with that first insane act of defiance on the shores of Hakata Bay. 200 warriors who believed that surrender was worse than death. 200 men whose courage echoed so loudly across history that it felt like the gods themselves answered their call. 200 samurai who stood before an empire and refused to move. And because of their stand, because of their refusal to bow, Japan remained unconquered, its culture preserved, its traditions protected, and its warrior spirit carved forever into legend. Because while the world romanticizes the divine wind, the samurai never forgot the terror they had faced before the storm arrived. They remembered the thunder of Mongol drums that rattled the very earth beneath their feet. They remembered the explosive bombs, the teppo, that sent deadly shards ripping through armor and bone. They remembered the shield walls, the disciplined formations, the ruthless precision of an army forged in the fires of conquest. They remembered that if not for a single twist of fate, the Mongols would have carved Japan into the Yuan dynasty like another province on a map. And so the Japanese did something extraordinary. They changed. They adapted. They evolved. For generations, samurai warfare had been dominated by one-on-one duels, glorious showcases of skill, honor, and personal valor. But the Mongols had shattered that illusion in a single day. On the sands of Hakata, warriors who sought heroic solo combat had been torn apart by volleys of massed arrows. Men who charged forward to challenge a single Mongol officer found themselves surrounded by troops who cared nothing for ritual or honor. The Mongols were not impressed by sword forms passed down for centuries. They did not admire the beauty of a perfectly executed strike. They fought to win. And that brutal efficiency forced the samurai to rethink everything they knew about war. The shogunate began constructing massive stone walls along the coastline of Hakata Bay, walls stretching for miles, rising so high and reinforced so heavily that no Mongol ship could land without facing a fortress the moment its crew set foot on Japanese soil. These were unlike anything Japan had built before. They weren't temples, they weren't castles. They were engineered barriers designed specifically to repel a Mongol invasion. Samurai clans were ordered to station permanent garrisons along the coast, ready at all times. Watchtowers rose across cliffs. Signal fires were placed at strategic points, enabling messages to travel across provinces in minutes. The warrior class changed from a proud but scattered collection of regional fighters into an integrated defensive network with one purpose: prevent the Mongols from ever landing again. Yet it wasn't just infrastructure that evolved. The samurai themselves underwent a transformation. The lessons of the first invasion were printed into their bodies, their strategies, their weapons. Archery drills were revised to counter Mongol volleys. Swordsmiths began developing blades specifically designed to pierce foreign armor. Armorers reinforced the lamellar plates with thicker iron segments to withstand the shock of explosives and heavy composite arrows. Entire schools of warfare emerged, dedicated to studying Mongol tactics. Samurai learned to fight not as isolated champions, but as coordinated units, capable of defending in formation, launching organized counterattacks, and responding to signals like modern soldiers. The nation. What saved Japan was not a single warrior cutting down dozens of foes in a blaze of glory. What saved Japan was unity. 200 men binding themselves to a cause so unbreakable that even the greatest empire of its age was forced to hesitate. And that shift in thinking would echo through the centuries, shaping Japanese warfare, politics, and culture long after the Mongol threat disappeared. But even as Japan prepared, Kublai Khan was preparing too. Across the sea in China, the Yuan emperor could not tolerate the insult he had suffered. To lose soldiers in battle was acceptable. To lose ships in storms was unfortunate. But to have his invasion stalled, by what he considered a primitive warrior class from an insignificant island was absolutely unacceptable. Kublai Khan commanded entire continents. He controlled silk routes, royal courts, cities carved from stone and gold. His empire stretched from the forests of Siberia to the warm rivers of Indochina. How could Japan, a realm he believed should have capitulated with a single ultimatum, dare to resist? The first invasion had been only a test, an opening strike meant to intimidate Japan into submission. But now the Khan's wrath was stirred. His advisors urged caution, pointing out the fleet's catastrophic losses and the enormous cost of another campaign. But Kublai saw things differently. Conquering Japan had become personal. It wasn't about resources. It wasn't about land. It wasn't even about strategy. It was about pride. The grandson of Genghis Khan could not allow a tiny archipelago to defy his will. And so he ordered the construction of an invasion force the world would not surpass for centuries. Shipbuilders from Korea and China labored day and night. Tens of thousands of soldiers were conscripted. Siege engines were prepared. New explosives were developed. The second Mongol invasion force grew into a monstrous creation, an armada that, by some records, exceeded 4,000 ships and carried more than 140,000 men. To put that into perspective, that was larger than the Spanish Armada, larger than many modern armies, larger than any force Japan had ever faced in its history. And as the fleet assembled, word of its size spread like wildfire. Nations across Asia trembled at the scale of it. Even the Mongol generals privately admitted that this was no longer a campaign, it was an apocalypse being forged. Back in Japan, the samurai understood what was coming. They sharpened their blades, tightened their armor, reinforced their walls. Farmers trained with spears, monks practiced with staves. Women prepared supplies in mountain temples. Even children carried stones to reinforce defensive lines. The entire nation held its breath, waiting for the horizon to darken again with the sails of an empire. And then, in the summer of 1281, the second Mongol invasion arrived. It came in two waves, one from Korea, another from southern China, and together, the two fleets formed a floating kingdom of war. Japanese scouts watched from cliffs as ship after ship after ship appeared in the mist, an endless procession of black hulls cutting through the water like blades. The Mongol commanders intended to land quickly, overwhelm coastal defenses, and march inland before the Japanese could mount a coordinated response. But they were too late. Japan was not the same nation they had tested years before. The stone walls of Hakata rose like iron giants. The samurai archers, once scattered across provinces, now lined the ramparts shoulder to shoulder, and when the Mongols attempted to land, their ships were met with a thunderstorm of arrows thick enough to blot out the sun. But the Mongols pressed forward anyway. They had faced walls before. They had conquered cities surrounded by fortifications far more elaborate than anything Japan could build. Their siege engineers prepared massive ladders. Their troops braced shields. Their archers returned fire. Yet every time they gained even a few yards of beach, the samurai surged forward in terrifying coordinated charges. Not the chaotic hero duels of the past, but disciplined waves of warriors acting as a single force. Mongol officers, expecting to exploit the same weaknesses they had seen before, instead found themselves fighting an enemy who had studied them, adapted to them, and learned how to counter every tactic they used. And still, the Mongols pushed on. For days, the battle seesawed between the coastline and the surf, neither side willing to back down. But the Japanese had discovered a crucial advantage. The Mongol ships, built in haste for the second invasion, were not crafted with the same precision as the first fleet. Some were river barges, retrofitted for ocean travel. Others were made of hastily assembled timber, their hulls weaker, their seams prone to leaking. The fleet was enormous, but it was brittle, and Japan only needed one moment, one chance, for nature to tip the scales again. That moment arrived with a whisper on the wind. At first, it was only a shift in the air, just enough to make the banners flutter strangely. Then came the low rumble of distant waves beating against the shore in patterns the fishermen recognized immediately. By nightfall, storm clouds piled above the horizon like mountains of darkness. Samurai commanders pointed to the sky and felt the hairs on their arms rise. They had seen this before. They knew this omen. And as the first drops of rain hit the coastal stones, the Mongols realized too late that they were trapped in the exact same position as the first invasion. The second kamikaze struck with apocalyptic force. The winds slammed into the Mongol fleet with such violence that entire rows of ships flipped like leaves. Masts snapped in half like toothpicks. Hulls cracked open. Raging waves tossed vessels into one another, smashing them to splinters. Soldiers clung to anything they could. Planks, ropes, shattered beams, only to be pulled beneath the water by armor weighing hundreds of pounds. Fires erupted on some ships as lightning struck their decks. Others simply vanished beneath the waves, swallowed whole by the sea. It was carnage on a scale even the Mongols had never experienced. From the cliffs, the samurai watched again, not with celebration, but with awe. They knew their bravery had brought Japan to this point. They knew their resistance had set the stage. But witnessing a second divine wind tear apart an army 3 times larger than the first made even the most stoic warriors feel the breath of something greater than themselves. When dawn arrived, the ocean was littered with debris, bodies and fragments of what had once been the greatest armada ever assembled. Japan had survived a second time. And after that disaster, the Mongol Empire, already cracking under its own weight, never again attempted to invade Japan. Kublai Khan died before he could rebuild another fleet. His successors faced rebellions, economic collapse, and political fragmentation. The empire that had once seemed destined to rule the world began to crumble, and as it did, the legend of the samurai only grew stronger. For centuries, storytellers in Japan spoke of the 200 warriors who stood against an impossible army. Priests told of the divine wind that protected the islands. Artists painted scenes of fierce samurai battling against Mongol hordes. Parents taught their children the lesson that courage, unity, and discipline could stop even the greatest threats. And the samurai, the class forged in the fires of Hakata Bay, became the beating heart of Japanese culture. But here's the greatest truth hiding beneath the legend. History is not shaped by numbers. It is shaped by will. The Mongols had 50,000 men. The samurai had 200. The The Mongols had explosives, siege engines, and the momentum of a world-conquering empire. The samurai had only their blades, their honor, and an unshakable refusal to kneel. And sometimes, that is enough to change the destiny of an entire nation. Because in the end, the story of how 200 samurai destroyed 50,000 Mongol invaders is not really about swords or storms or strategy. It is about spirit. It is about defiance. It is about standing on a beach with no hope of victory and choosing to fight anyway. Not because you expect to win, but because your soul demands it. And that kind of courage, the kind that burns brighter than fear, can reshape history. It did in 1274. It did again in 1281. And it became the foundation of the samurai legend that still captivates the world today.